Good evening, welcome. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Thanks for coming along and investing in tonight. I'm Robbie Bushe. I'm a painter. I'm a Royal Scottish Academician and I work here at the University of Edinburgh in the Centre for Open Learning. Flora Lethang, who's the head of programmes here at the RSA, and myself co-created the exhibition that this talk at this symposium is all based around. Approximately 9 months ago, we had a great opportunity to curate an exhibition that delved into the landscapes of contemporary painting in Scotland. This represented a significant milestone, as there had not been a comprehensive survey of this nature for decades, if at all really, certainly not painting. For over half a century, the realm of painting has encountered notable challenges within academic circles, where it's contended with the dominance of research and the rising focus of new and emerging media. Nonetheless, what has been truly remarkable is the burgeoning contemporary art scene in Scotland, with student and graduates breathing new life into the medium of painting, thus offering a fresh, relevant perspective on modern-day art, along with many established Scottish painters. Now, I've been a painter since roughly 1990 when I graduated, and I've taught in many different institutions. I've been a champion for painting all that time, despite myself meddling into video, animation, construction, even performance. And a former colleague once said to me, I was waxing lyrical about one of Scotland's painting departments in one of the Scotland's 5 art colleges, I won't say which one. And he said to me, don't get too fetishistic about painting. I think he meant fetishistic. But that's exactly what I am. And I think that's exactly what the 31 artists that we have presented in Frontiers are too, in their own way. We'll find out a little bit more about that. The process of selecting the 31 in this exhibition unfolded seamlessly. At least I think so. After drafting our initial lists, Flora and I came together with our top 20 artists, and roughly, I think it was 8 or 9 of them were the same artists. So we kind of were on the same wavelength. So then we haggled and looked at who would make up and how many we would have in the spaces below. The RSA obviously has a big angle on this. We've included, I think it's 8 academicians. We've included also a number of recent graduates, when I say recent, from the last 15 years, from our New Contemporaries programme, where we select some of the best artists graduating from the 5 Scottish art colleges. And we wanted to put them in the mix, as well as some long-standing established painters. 1 or 2 are here, I can see. Each artist we invited to articulate a short paragraph, why they engage in painting, what painting means to them. And you can read the full versions in the catalogue. That if you haven't got one, I'm sure you'll be able to pick up one on the way out tonight. I just want to finish, before I introduce the artists, some little nibbles of some of the things I picked out today from 1 or 2 of the artists. Painting is the elephant in its own room, said Derek Guild, Royal Scottish Academy. What's that about? You need to read more. There is a fastness and slowness to painting that allows for an immediate realization of an image alongside a longer consideration of what it might take to make image work and be relevant. And that's John Brown, and you'll see his hundreds of small pieces downstairs of little nuggets of painting. The nature of materiality of paint as a tool holds so much possibility. Painting is this wonderful collision of alchemy and ideas, by Lily McRae. If I didn't paint, I'd get accused of staring. Catherine Davison. Painting has been so entwined with my life for so long now, it's not so much what I do, but who I am, I think, through painting. That's Andrew Cranston. I'd like to finish on a little short poem by Finn Robinson, who wrote a poem for his practice. I paint because I like it. I paint because I always have. I paint to feel connected. And I paint because there are things I need to show you, things you need to see, things I'd struggle to speak, to think, to feel, to touch, to be. So plenty more of those in our catalogue. And I think the important part of that is this very precious tactile quality that I'm sure our four guests tonight will talk about. We're going to have a series of presentations by first Audrey Grant, then Jack Dunnett, then Rowan Paton, and we'll end up with Toby Paterson, about 10-15 minutes each. And then there'll be opportunity for us all to have a conversation and ask questions at the end. So if there are things that you're wanting to ask, or things that occur to you, make sure you keep them in mind. I've got a few to ask myself as well, so we'll get going with that. But first of all, I'd like to welcome to the stage Audrey Grant.
Thank you, Robbie. And firstly, I would just like to say many thanks indeed to him, Robbie Bushe, to Flora Lathang, and all the team at the RSA for inviting me to take part in this exhibition with such an exceptional group of artists. I know there's an enormous amount of work goes into these kind of exhibitions, so thank you very much indeed for all your hard work in putting it together and making it look so wonderful in the galleries. Just a sort of brief introduction and context to my current work in the exhibition and where I've sort of come from in recently. So I am a painter, and up to probably around 2020, I built a career really creating and exhibiting expressive, semi-abstract, figurative paintings in oils. I've always been fascinated by the act of painting and the painted surface, and my work has largely been informed by intellectual ideas from poetry and philosophy. But that wasn't enough. We're never happy, are we? So I took a big sidestep to ask other questions and explore new subject matter such as landscape, and expand my practice to include photography and installation, in the hope that it would impact and renew my painting practice, which I felt it needed. But I knew I had to take myself out of my comfort zone if I was to make any progress at all. When I began to prepare this talk, I reflected a little bit on the title of the exhibition, Frontiers, Painting in Scotland, and also the title of this symposium, Other Worlds. And it made me consider other things, such as the personal and the collective, the macrocosm and the microcosm, and how in some way art acts as an interface between the two and helps us navigate this threshold. It led me to reread an essay in a monograph that accompanied a recent exhibition in Lille by the German painter and sculptor Anselm Kiefer. It was the first exhibition of his photographic works, and I was very lucky to be able to visit the exhibition. And I found what I think is quite an interesting quote that helps us navigate this idea of a frontier. He says, "When I talk about a frontier, I'm talking about our very essence. We are the membrane between the macrocosm and the microcosm, between the interior, what we are, and the exterior, which is also what we are. Art itself is a frontier defined by the notion of a boundary. It is always on a knife edge, on the border between imitation and abstraction." So there's always a tension, a constant push and pull in the process in an attempt to arrive at something, a sort of longing, which never really ends, but it's the longing that keeps us going. See if this works. There we go. So the first slide image is of a little painting that's upstairs in the RSA, or downstairs in the RSA even. And the title comes from a line in a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, and it's called Psalter, number 6. And I found it in a poem called The Boy Who Watches, which I found referenced in a wonderful book by the historian Leslie Chamberlain called Rilke, The Last Inward Man. And I just want to quote a little bit from the poem. "A storm is raging, altering forest and trees and time, and everything is forever. The land is like a psalter. Things are grave and heavy here, beyond our tether." Chamberlain goes on to say, if the landscape is like a psalter, if the landscape is like a psalm book as we look out, then the implication is that it encloses us like a church. And so again, Rilke as he does so much in his work, captures the dual effect. We're both inside and outside life itself. If we're poets, that's what makes us sing, or perhaps if we're artists, that's what makes us want to paint. So these little paintings are book-like in appearance, but I also see them as metaphors for the landscape. And the landscape as memory, as the memory of history, as Kiefer would always say as well, and the layers of history that exist within it. So the paintings have a deliberate, aged look and feel. These paintings have been made from a variety of materials which have gone through various processes. Materials such as raw canvas has been attached and removed from the little painting. They've been stapled together. I've used a chemical called ferric chloride mixed into the paint, which discolours the paint, and I've also used it to discolour other aspects of the painting. Newsprint, sandpaper, etc. have all been added and removed to reveal something of the history of its making. Then covered over again with paint and removed again, allowing cracks and scars and layers. So in some way, they reflect what often does happen to a landscape. So if the landscape was a book, a psalter, then it is also an interior, layered, scarred and wounded. In this next image, another storm is raging. This time, it's piling wreckage upon wreckage. This is actually a photograph, obviously it's not a painting. And the title of it is called On the Concept of History for Walter Benjamin. And it's a photograph I took, and I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. But the title comes from Walter Benjamin's 9th thesis on the concept of history. And in it, Benjamin interprets Paul Clay's Angelus Novus, which is one of his beautiful oil transfer drawings, as a tragic allegory of history, turned to the past and watching the historical process as one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage, while a storm is blowing from paradise prevents him from repairing the damage. So this is a large black and white analogue photograph that I took inside the former RAF Grangemouth aircraft hangar, which was built before the Second World War. I grew up in Grangemouth, so I knew this building well from the outside, but not the inside. And it was ripped out for development last year. And I sought and was allowed permission to go in twice to photograph it. And this is what I found, a palimpsest of past, present and future, and began to think about it in a very kind of layered way. The objective facts, a found-built environment, and as a metaphor for history, for memory, loss and transition, and a very subjective and personal attitude as well because of my connection to that landscape and environment and how I felt about it. It was the landscape I grew up with, industrial, raw, smelly, noisy, etc. And in some way it was Kiefer who helped me realise that it could be a subject for art and that I would approach it initially through analogue photography, which I feel has a painterly quality. This painting is called On the Concept of History, The Wound, and it's a painting that I say it came from what I'm going to call a failed painting. The history, the detritus from a creative process stitched together with surgical suture and string. These are the painting rags that I used and became covered in oil paint as I wiped the paint around and off the painting I was working on at the time. And as I went through these rags, I laid them down on the floor underneath the canvas to catch the drips. So as they piled up in the studio, more layers of rubble and ruin, these used painting rags revealed a new possibility of creative renewal. The question is it a painting? This is another photograph, but this time it has an intervention in it, it has a painterly intervention in it. It's of some gate pier fragments in the Garden of Time at Stirling University, where I spent a year as the artist in residence, and it was shown in my exhibition there called Memoria, which just actually finished in August. And I was employed there to look at the Airthry, the ancient Airthry estate, now with a modern university on it. And again, I found it was a found environment, another palimpsest, a landscape where the past is visible in the present. And so here I've created an additional element with oil paint, exploring the interface between photography and painting. This is my last slide, and this is also in the exhibition upstairs, and it's called Die Nicht, die Niemandsrose, the Nothing, the No One's Rose. And it's the larger painting in the exhibition, and the title of it comes from a poem called Sam by the Romanian-born poet Paul Celan, who survived the Holocaust but lost his parents to it. His poetry is quite extraordinary and very, very powerful because of what he does with language. Words are his materials and he transforms them. I was very struck by this sentence in the poem, so this kind of negation seemed to reflect something that was going on in the painting, I think. The painting uses the same approach and types of materials as the Psalter series, but in this one the title is scrolled across the top of the painting, and I've added 2 found newsprint images from the Second World War, so it becomes a sort of history painting as well. So to end my short talk, I think my work at present explores themes of memory loss and transition through a creative engagement with landscapes that have been through their own transformations. And I'm trying to explore this on a personal collective level through painting, installation, and analogue photography. I would like to make just one final personal note. When I said to you at the beginning of my talk that I took a sidestep back in 2020 to do this work. The reason I was able to do it is that I was awarded a grant from the Creative Scotland Open Fund, which was vital to that. So I very much hope that that funding can be reinstated as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Hello? Hello. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Cool, thank you. That was really good. Lower your expectations. I'd like to thank Robbie and Flora for including me in this exhibition. Obviously, it's great to take part and this talk as well. I didn't expect so many people to be here. I'm just going to sort of, here we go. This is where I started. When I was thinking about what to say for this event to avoid having to have any original thoughts of my own, I typed in talk about painting in Scotland into YouTube. Unfortunately, there's nothing there really. I think the first 5 videos were talking about artists talking about their own practice. Then there's a couple of BBC short clips about a guy who paints iron brew cans on buildings in Dundee or something. But importantly, the first 2 results that came up were these sponsored videos here. So I feel it's important for me to let you know that unfortunately you're a few days too late to get your limited edition hand-signed prints from Damien Hirst. But thankfully, as far as I'm aware, you can still buy your Scottish canvas prints from Stephen Brown Art. That's available at stephenbrownart.co.uk, sorry. The discussion tonight could be quite broad, based on all the potential areas of conversation surrounding the theme of the exhibition, so I can only really talk about my own thoughts surrounding the way I work and why I think I might work that way, and some of my intrusive thoughts with the helpful aid of images of some of my work. So this piece is a recent piece of mine. It's called Les Artistes. It's not that big. It's small. I'll give an overview of my work. So I basically make figurative paintings which often depict some sort of narrative scene centered around quotidian aspects of life. I guess that's the broad overview. I work in sketchbooks, drawing interactions between figures and their surroundings, which can come from scenes that I encounter in real life, stories I read, films, memories, music, or myth. And then work with these ideas which come alongside a set of sort of abstract grounds which use various paints and chemicals with varying levels of control, and then add and strip away layers through glazing and sanding. For me, the interest in painting lies in conveying a narrative or even a sentiment, not only through the scene depicted, but also through the use of materials of the paint to allude to the fact that a painting is very much a painting, and it's aware of what it is, and it's not masquerading as any other sort of form of documentation. It's defined by its only stipulation, which is that it involves paint. This painting is called A Tribute to Attrition, and it sort of came about as an exercise in perverse, mild artistic self-flagellation. It's an old board that I'd painted years ago, actually, and I really liked what I'd painted on it, but then I painted over it again and destroyed it, and then painted over that again, and I actually painted another painting on top of that, which I really liked, but then I deliberately painted over that with this. And I don't know why, but at the time I think I was trying to figure something out about the medium. Why did I paint in a certain way? Why do I continue to paint in a certain way? Why am I a painter? What am I painting about? When I'm asked what I do in a social setting and have to admit to being a painter, after explaining that I don't mean painter and decorator, but I mean painter as in painter, painting pictures, the next question is always, what sort of stuff? Like landscape, portrait, watercolours. And my go-to line to describe what I do is always sort of like wee figures in landscape. And I thought that's quite a factual, decent way to get it across, but whenever you say that yourself, you sort of hear it put that way, and it's frustratingly reductive, because it always makes me think about the importance of seeing paintings in person and the presence of the material being about as important as the subject. Not only through endless amount of writing and talking that can be done around painting, but the ubiquity of screens through which people see paintings, phone screens and computer screens. The importance of looking at a painting in the flesh can so often be overlooked, I think. There's an innate interest in the human hand, which I don't think we can get away from. People want to see movement and time captured in an object with hairs and cracks and edges. So this particular piece was me just allowing myself to play solely with materials, challenging myself to make a piece without oil paints or a brush, but just with house paints, sandpaper and varnishes. On top of this old painting, elements which still come through when you look closely, but actually can't be seen in a photograph. For all intents and purposes, though, when it comes to describing the image, it is just a wee figure in a landscape. Often when I'm working out how to best navigate the balance between material and subject, I find that the layering process of sort of adding and taking away, glazing and carving, allows the necessary time for the subject to reveal itself in the process. I find there's a certain tension between the marks made through harsher, less controllable methods and the more delicate, ordered and comfortable application of the traditional oil paint and brush. They provide a different surface. A different service. Whether a pattern, structure or figure is rendered by addition or by subtraction almost imperceivably alters the atmosphere of a painting based on a certain level of unconscious knowledge that we have about painting or about marks in general. The close-knit lines of an etching can be uniform and precise to minimise their presence in deference to a subject. But if they're haphazard and chicken scratch in all directions, then that can suggest a chaos or a desperation which may align with the subject or juxtapose it. In recent years, in certain pockets of British figurative painting, I've noticed there to be a level of fear that drives some painters, a possibly well-founded fear, based on the question of relevance of the tradition of painting. And one can be forgiven for looking at a certain overall view of the history of painting and seeing standout themes of upholding a certain beauty standard, idealization of frivolous narratives, lightheartedness, romanticism with a small r, conservatism with a small c, balanced composition, pleasing colour combinations, decoration, etc. And the fear of being perceived to be making work surrounding these things can logically lead one to react to these elements as a point of defiance by trying to depict the opposites of these qualities. Opposite of these qualities. So sort of saying things like, I'll paint deliberately grotesquely, there shall be no narrative, I shall be edgy, I shall use muddy and acidic colours, I shall distort the figure and unbalance the composition. I've certainly felt such a pressure myself, but unfortunately I've found that the reactionary approach of simply flipping these elements obviously just results in a similarly narrow viewpoint, which is directly defined by the standards which one aims to subvert. So you end up with a school of work that shares a certain aesthetic and is labouring under the naive assumption that it hasn't been done already and is in some way cutting edge. As in most endeavours, there is something to be said for the push to find a nuanced middle ground. And I think that there's a strength in Scottish contemporary painting in general that doesn't so easily jump into quick fixes all at once. It seems to have a strength in giving ideas the time they need to mature, respecting the viewer's ability to discern slightly more subtle flavours. There's a potential here for me to make some sort of metaphor regarding whiskey, but that's so wanky I couldn't possibly commit to that. In my own work, I find it's always a challenge to decipher how much of a story I want to reveal with a painting and how much of it's left up to interpretation through ambiguity. I feel that although there's a certain collective unconscious of symbols, archetypes and references that people inexorably link with certain meanings, there's also a lot that can be done with figures interacting with their surroundings that can hint towards certain things, but also will inevitably tell different stories to different viewers. And I find paintings to be the perfect place for these stories to unfold. I'm often drawn to stories told from the perspective of an unreliable narrator, a figure who's telling you something filtered through their own perspective, giving an outline of a story but with additions and omissions that force you to question their motive or agenda. It reminds me of a certain kind of person you meet who begins telling some story about their life that you never asked to hear and aren't really invested in. The pub man, the ubiquitous pub man, a person who appears at your table around half an hour before last orders to slur to you that he was nearly in the band Simple Minds if he hadn't lost 3 fingers in that gangland fight. Or the person on the megabus who gives their abridged life story culminating in the reason they're taking the bus to Preston at 5 in the morning. These stories always have elements which are clearly born of some kind of truth, if only to that person themselves. Some are worryingly believable, leaving you hoping that they're not true, but suspecting that they are. So often, though, they are underpinned by a reframing of the past and a telling of a sort of hyper-real half-truth, in which everything that has come before could have been something else in an alternative reality. I find that this position lends itself to painting quite well. It's said you should write about what you know, and I find that helpful in painting too. But the temptation to paint about what you don't know always persists, and thankfully the paint allows it. With painting being an image which isn't an image, an object which isn't an object, and with vast grounds for subjectivity, I find it an ideal sort of absurd stage on which to play or wrestle with certain contemplations and contradictions. In thinking about why I choose to paint, I'm often taken to thinking about the utility of a painter, or myself, I suppose, and left questioning the value of what I do, because it's quite an absurd thing to do with your life, to be fair. And in terms of things that one could do that would be of more definable value. I'm in no real rush to dispel that unease, though, because I think that to some degree a universal question of finding meaning in life is what that sort of is, and it's something that everyone struggles with at some point or another. That's another trite observation from my big book of cliches, but I do think that existential questioning is a sort of idling motor which exists somewhere in everyone, and it presents itself in a search for validation or commonality. It's probably harder to find certainty in your utility when you paint pictures for a living rather than perform heart surgery, for instance, but I'd have to say that's definitely fair enough. I'd be interested... I'm not going to say that bit, that's quite rude. I personally find comfort in the fact that painting is what it is, and it can speak to everything and nothing, and is aware of that. A painting just exists and is vulnerable, and is a construction frozen in time, and at the complete mercy and gaze of those who view it, much like anyone is before you get to know them. This final painting... Sorry, I realise I've not actually been talking about the paintings that are on screen, but I'm just sort of rambling in general. This final painting is called A Local Authority, and I'll say a bit about it to end. The buildings in the background I actually painted years ago. I think it's a distillery possibly, on the banks of the Clyde, just south of Glasgow Green. I used to be able to see it from my old studio. I rarely paint real places as they are, but I'd wanted to paint the chimney for a while, so one day I just did. And it sat there for years, until I recently took it to completion. I think the reason it took so long to finish is because I couldn't figure out why I wanted to paint this place. And there's a fear in me that when I hear the term Scottish painting, that there's this idea of romantic landscapes or an iconic landmark, or God forbid a Highland cow just screaming to be depicted on a shortbread tin. And it's easy to get sort of itchy when you perceive a perception of something that pigeonholes you. There's nothing romantic or iconic about this chimney on the Clyde, but I worried that my want to paint it came from some adolescent draw to paint industrial spaces as a subversion of this perception of Scottish landscapes that I'd gleaned from somewhere or other. I have no interest in being deliberately and predictably contrary by claiming that the Banana Flats are as beautiful as Edinburgh Castle, for instance, but a part of me does think that they're both worthy of being painted. But does that mean I want to paint them for that reason? No. I'm not interested in that, but should I be? I don't know. This is why I don't talk about my paintings. It's just sort of a masturbatory loop that is of help and interest to nobody. But the initial painting of the building, yeah, I set it aside, forgot about it, but after a few years, I still wanted to paint it, and I found the old painting, and I went to finish it. And at that point, I knew why. I wanted to paint it because I saw it every day, and I wanted to paint what I saw. It was frustratingly simple in the end, and I realised that the reasons not to paint it were artificial and formed by a sort of backward logic of thinking about people thinking about painting. I think the few dedicated painting courses in Scotland are important because they don't seem to feel the need to put the cart before the horse in that way, and they don't even entertain the idea of working backward from an audience perception, unlike some other art courses might be led into doing. Little attention is paid to the need to be ball-wrenchingly relevant at all times because trends change and artists need time to find their voice, and it's important to give oneself time to paint without urgency sometimes, without a fear of missing the boat on some fleeting flavour of the moment. To conclude, I think that contemplation, a mistrust of needless urgency, a respect for an audience, and an appreciation of nuance are all traits which I find are exemplified in the work of the Scottish contemporary painters that I admire. And yeah, it's been a privilege to be asked to show my work on the same wall as these painters. So thank you very much for listening to me. Cheers.
Hello. Can you hear me okay? I've definitely got too many slides, so bear with me. I just wanted to echo what's been said already. A huge thanks to Robbie and Flora and the team at the RSA. It's been a total honour to hang next to these amazing artists and to be chosen. When the email came in, I actually didn't believe it. So I had to get my partner to check it because I was like, that can't be real. So much of what I do is informed by my childhood. So this might be a little bit different from other people's talks. What I was looking at then, so what I'm going to do is just very briefly touch on that because it explains why I do what I do. So growing up, I was looking at the landscape of Arran, the island of Arran in the west coast. I think it properly embedded in my psyche as a wee girl because the desire to be there and look at it has never really left me. And the immersion in that landscape, all landscape, but that landscape is really important to me. Something about that particular place is magical. The mountains, the history, the folklore. the ghost stories, my personal history there. That's my mum and my daughter, by the way. People talk about thin places, and I think Harren's a thin place. I definitely believe that. I was also looking at my great-grandfather's paintings. That's the top right-hand side image. He was a watercolourist, and they were all over our house as I was growing up. He was called Toby Paton and born in 1869, just for a date reference. He was a stonemason, a fisherman, and a painter on the island, and he taught himself to paint in the mountains outside on plein air. And I think it was probably a refuge from all of the day jobs, so nothing changes for artists there. Part of the same clan, albeit the posh Edinburgh Dunfermline side, was Sir Joseph Noel Paton on the bottom left. That's my photo from next door, actually. And his brother, Waller Hugh. These two are actually next door in the National Galleries. So they're pretty famous paintings. But their sister, they were both academicians at the RSA. But their sister was a bit of a genius. She was a sculptor. And obviously, because she was a woman, she was pretty much completely undersung. But that's changing now, because that bust is actually downstairs on the way into the show. She's being celebrated by the RSA, which is amazing. My great-grandfather Donald's son was Hugh Paton, who was also a painter, but he was sent to Glasgow School of Art by his dad because he wanted him to learn, basically, and he'd never had the chance. And this is one of my favourite paintings. It's actually in my living room, and I get to look at it every day. And I just absolutely love it. And his daughter is Avril Paton, my mother's cousin, who's famous for her Windows in the West painting, which is in Kelvin Grove, which no doubt everyone's seen. So with all of this going on in the background and hanging around the walls of our house, by 6 I was totally convinced I would be a painter because it felt totally normalised, actually. My mother was a single parent raising me in a council house in the West Coast, and it was challenging. So I think the images that were around our walls were kind of salve and a bit of an escapism for me. So my first experience of paint is that wee image on the top left. I was about 5 or 6. It's cut up cereal box, I think I remember, that my mother gave me. And I remember it because obviously she kept it, but I remember painting it, and I remember moving the paint around and loving that and making decisions simply about pattern and colour. And it felt like a valid activity. And I remember putting the paintbrush down and deciding it was finished confidently. As I got older, I drew just constantly and eventually got into art school at ECA. And I began sort of using text and language and incorporating those into my canvases fairly early doors, around second year. So I was looking at a lot of early Hockney at that point, and he was kind of a hero and an artist I still go back to. He's a bit of a king of just really good image making. My degree show was made up of stone and mixed media images with screen printing that I started using at that point, and I still use now and still love. And I was also looking at a lot of poetry, Walt Whitman and Edwin Morgan. I'm still looking at them. And then I completed a master's in the States, and after my degree show. So these two are both degree show paintings at the bottom. You can see the text and the screen printing, and all of those sort of pieces of red are just sewn pieces of fabric. I had no money at all in the States, like absolutely none. So they had an in-house print studio with everything I needed for free, basically. So I just spent all my time in there making different types of etchings, screen printing, text block prints and using collage, and I didn't perhaps understand it at the time, and small little polarized sized sort of created landscapes made with collage and epoxy resin and paint. I didn't realise it then, but I think with my degree show and this work later, it was a sort of gateway to what I was going to end up doing. I came home and I felt really numb. I stopped working completely, actually. And I think crucially, chemically, I was just incredibly depressed. So I gave up, actually. I just stopped working entirely. I went to be a teacher. And 10 years after that, I had a child, and it was like a reset. So I started very slowly working again, using cheap materials, paper, pencil, charcoal, working on walls, and then eventually started to incorporate linen into my practice on just small canvases. It's a really expensive surface, but it's amazing. It's really seductive. It's a brilliant raw texture for colour and empty space, which I've always preferred to leave in spaces, always. And I obviously still do. Very rarely do I cover the entire canvas with image or marks. It feels like where there's blank space, there's literal blank space, there's room to breathe. The addition of a graphic element, be it printed or collage, provides a sort of juxtaposition that visually that I find really satisfying. I've always loved design and using typeface, obviously, early doors, and it felt like a natural bedfellow to gestural mark making and, you know, a chaotic use of gestural paint and mixed media. The graphic element that I choose works best as a kind of sticker. I can move it around, play with it, turn the stretcher around, turn it upside down, remove it, replace it, just decide later. It's sort of like a canvas-based Photoshop, and everything sort of stays in flux until possibly the day before it's finished. Nothing's certain, and they work better when I've got time and space to play around. I usually start with a slow build-up of washes, which take a huge amount of time, days, actually. So a big puddle of pigment that needs to dry slowly, and then a build-up of gestural paint. It's quite an organic process at that point. If it's wrong, I'll turn it to the wall or take it out to the garden and power wash it. Like just like take the Kirchers comes out, and it's indestructible linen, which is amazing because it's my best pal, because I can batter these into submission depending on the size. Sometimes they go in the bath, but if they're big, like the ones in this show, they're outside with the power washer. I have been known to de-stretch and just stick them through a 60 because linen's so expensive. I mean, it's like beautiful, but it's like unbelievably expensive, so I'm just not wasting it. But there's something nice about the sort of visibility of that punch-up on the surface of the paintings. It kind of allows you to, it's like a palimpsest, it's a word that's been used tonight, but you can kind of see the journey a little bit, especially with the linen ones. That's a very large wash of colour that took about 9 hours to dry, and all eating and kitchen activity had to stop. Pattern and colour are huge draws for me, usually taken straight from nature. Pattern repeats is something that I like in other people's work, but also in my own. A small repeated mark is a pleasant thing to do. It slows me down and it keeps me present. Occasionally, I'll wake up with a fully formed idea, like magic, but usually it's just a wee faint notion or like a lyric or words or a narrative that just comes into focus while I paint. The paintings that I created for this exhibition were painted turnabout in tandem between January and May. One is this one, really, really dark, and the other one is sort of joyful. And it was dependent on my mental health on the day, on my mood of the day, which one I was working on. And I feel like that for me, possibly for other artists, that's how it works. So it just depends on how I'm feeling. Creating other worlds is, of course, what I do, but also what I like to look at. So any artist who makes a space for me to be part of or engage with will always be of interest, be it invented or just really good observed painting. If I feel moved by something or a painting, or if it has a strong resonance with me, it's usually because it's driven by the construction of a narrative, and be it literal or vague or memory-based, it doesn't really matter. It will usually feel as well like the artist has been vulnerable somehow when they've put the work out there. I was told once that if you're not embarrassed when you're hanging your own work, and that some sort of vulnerability hasn't been proffered, or that you don't feel naked, then I definitely wasn't doing it right. And that kind of still resonates now, because I think it's probably a little bit true. Thinking about painting in Scotland, which is part of the brief of this talk, I think it's at a really interesting stage. It's more interesting now than I think 10 or 20 years ago. It feels like there's a really good constructive dialogue about what it is or what it can be, and a healthy space for conversation about that, like tonight, for example. Whereas before, I think it felt a little bit surplus to requirement, like a dirty word or passé, or not clever enough, or not interesting enough. And it's cyclical, of course, but I believe that painting, I hope, that painting will always be around. Of course it will. Thank you. That's me.
Hello. Thanks, Rowan. Well, I want to echo what everyone else has said. Thank you to Robbie and Flora and everyone at the RSA for asking me to get involved in this really interesting exhibition and come along to engage with this conversation this evening. And I also, must also thank specifically my fellow painters who are talking tonight and are going to be on this panel discussion once I've finished. It's really interesting to see everybody's different perspectives on how to sort of address this brief of, how do we talk about Scottish painting in a contemporary sense. And I think it's been kind of sliced and diced in sort of three interesting ways already. And I, in a way, sort of slightly echoing kind of Rowan's sort of thinking back to sort of formative influences, I suppose. What I thought I would do in my wee chat here is almost sort of look at either end of kind of my sort of position, probably a 40-year-long period of sort of looking at and sort of thinking about painting. And in starting to kind of juggle with that notion, I realised, gosh, I don't know the last time I thought about Scottish painting in the way that it was sort of framed in this sort of RSA-based context. And it sort of sent me off down a sort of path, thinking, okay, where did my kind of engagement with painting come from? And inevitably it does go back to childhood. And this is a painting that I was very lucky to be able to grow up with, thanks to the foresight of my father, my late father, who in sort of sometime in the late 1970s got a bonus and spent, unlike his business partner, who spent his bonus on golf clubs and a Super 8 camera that I think gathered dust and are probably now deep in some Lanarkshire landfill somewhere. My old man bought this James Morrison painting of a burned out tenement in Maryhill, which I think kind of certainly bewildered his business partner, that's for sure. And it gradually sort of impinged on my consciousness as a child. It's quite a large work. That's probably just about 1-to-1 actually on the screen. And James Morrison made these works. I think the kind of initial sort of architectural studies or works that he made, I know there was one shown here a couple of years ago, sort of from the late 50s. This one I think is from the sort of early first half of the 70s. And it's kind of an intriguing thing for me to sort of consider how this sort of sat in my life. Probably by the age of 10, I'd kind of recognise this was maybe not a normal thing to be looking at in one's house. I was also aware, living in Glasgow, this was a painting pretty much about my city. It was recognisable, but also different from the kind of rarefied sort of downhill context that I was lucky to live in. This was about a mile away on Marano Street in Maryhill. And being, it's oil on board, so it's a really proper grown-up piece of art to be looking at as a young person, and it sort of allowed me to think about my domestic space, think about the city outside, think about ways of reading that, engaging with the world and thinking about it imaginatively, and not thinking along the lines of, as was said earlier, sort of painting, I think it was Jack said it, sort of painting sort of has to have this sort of picturesque function, not at all. So it's a little bit of a kind of motherlode for me. And having kind of work around sort of as a young person is sort of, a privilege, and I think it's sort of it was critical for me as an artist, sort of starting to develop as a child. And my grandparents had this work, which I'm now lucky enough to own, by Robert Stewart, who's much better known as a designer, but this was a work made in 1969. So Robert Stewart taught in the design department, was head of design department at Glasgow School of Art. Product designer, sort of graphic artist, really sort of extraordinarily sort of energetic imagination, sort of dynamic sort of visual maker. And this hung in my grandparents' house in Argyll, and again was another one of these things that sort of crept into my sort of peripheral vision, and landed in a way that an interesting way, sort of reflecting on it now, that it felt more like an object than anything else, which I guess sort of is slightly redolent of Stuart's sort of practice as a designer first and foremost. Also not necessarily made with art materials. These works were made with Procyon dyes. I should say all the images in this presentation are mine. any poor quality images do not reflect on a photographer or an artist or a gallery. Note the handles on my wardrobe reflected in the glass here. So there was something sort of resonated with this work for me, in that this is so sort of intense, sort of has a sort of synesthetic kind of quality to it, and I think is probably an introductory kind of point of sort of colour into my life, thinking about colour in relation to kind of image making, and probably it was a major factor in starting my love affair with sort of colours in the vermilion range, which down the years have kind of popped up in my work a lot of times. And obviously, unlike the last work, the previous work is not a representational work. So from early doors, I was sort of grappling with the sort of notion of sort of representation and abstraction. And I think I probably kind of bounced back and forth between those poles over the last kind of 30 years of kind of actively making art. And as I kind of grew up in Glasgow and was dragged by my parents to exhibitions, I will be forever grateful to them for that. But also latterly starting to kind of get out into the world myself and sort of engage with work, seeing kind of work like this, painting by Jack Knox from the 1970s, but it's in the collection of Glasgow museums. And I came across it. It was shown at Goma in Glasgow a couple of years ago. It's the first time I'd kind of come across it. It was almost like a kind of distant memory that I'd seen it when I was young, and it was like meeting an old friend again. It's such a kind of fascinating work, a sort of pivotal point of, I guess, the kind of stirrings of sort of postmodernism in Scottish painting, where you have on one hand this sort of reference to 17th century Dutch still life, and I like to think maybe a little nod to sort of, French purist painting as well, but placed within this sort of pictorial space that becomes abstracted. This work is titled Snack in a Dutch Museum, so it's got Jack Knox's sort of deadpan sort of comedic edge to it, which is really appealing as well, but kind of pictorially kind of breaking down into geometric form while still having a really recognizable sort of representational sort of element to it, and all these things kind of come together, I think, in my work, in terms of working as a painter, working as an artist. It's in many ways, it's really funny to hear Jack talk earlier on about those conversations you get into about what do you do, painter? Oh no, I actually make paintings. My version of that is I'd always say I was an artist. It's a taxi driver conversation where, oh yeah, artist pal, what do you paint? The assumption is you paint. And you go, oh, maybe I did make a correct decision at some point in the past. The implication is then, do you paint portraits or landscapes? I'm a landscape painter, mate. That's what I do. And then after about a decade of having conversations like that, I realised, oh, I probably am a landscape painter. And I think it's so sort of intriguing to hear my sort of fellow artists and painters talking tonight, the extent to which painting is a sort of lens through which to refract experience, or a kind of vessel to sort of pour that experience into and sort of mix it up and make something else out of it. This, I think, is at the root of why painting will be is sustainable as an activity and sort of resists obsolescence. There are always new ways of sort of using it to kind of filter reality or kind of conjure sort of interpretations of experience. And this is a work that was actually shown in the Academicians Gallery a couple of years ago. Came out of a body of work that I made for an exhibition in Glasgow in 2019 that was open very briefly and then shut as a result of COVID kicking in. So it's in many ways it's from a kind of lost body of work. And although this kind of got back out there in some ways, and is a sort of, I picked this as a good example of work of mine that has probably had about a sort of 20 odd year sort of gestation. It's a work called Mesodam, and it was really the result of a kind of long-term reflection on experience of the first time I went to the city of Berlin in the sort of mid-90s. And that, in that sense, it's a sort of landscape from a distance with all the kind of the subjective kind of qualities of initial experience, the kind of degradation of memory, but through it kinesthetic aspects that can be brought out in a work through composition. The through line of colour in memory, which I suspect is really kind of quite a large part of life for a lot of the other people who've spoken tonight. Trying to find ways of capturing an essence, capturing and communicating. I'm not terribly interested in expression. It's much more about an attempt, and probably almost inevitably a futile attempt at communication of a feeling, often one that has sort of kinesthetic qualities. And obviously that is then destined to sort of stand or fall given on the perspective of the viewer, and that's absolutely fine by me. But this felt like a little bit of a breakthrough work that's really led on in many ways to some of the works that I'm exhibiting in Frontiers at the moment. And similarly, that sort of notion of kind of living with experience and trying to find a way to sort of externalize it and communicate it, whether it is the work in the opening slide is titled Caravel, that is in the current exhibition here, and that's based on an experience in Marseille, sort of in just really recently, sort of in January, a really strong sort of colour and sort of spatial experience that sort of fixed itself in memory. These things sometimes kind of appear rapidly. Other times, it might take kind of, as I say, a couple of decades to emerge. And sort of through this reaching for me, that what's starting to feel a little bit like a kind of distillation point in my practice, I've kind of been around the houses quite a lot, and a kind of motivating kind of factor in that has been probably a little bit of guilt or sort of I don't know, just sort of the oddness of saying to taxi drivers that you're a painter, and grappling with that notion of painting and my kind of conflicted feelings about it that probably again stem from earlier in my life and being at Glasgow School of Art in the first half of the 90s and having to live with the legacy of that previous sort of phase of painting, which was so heroic and in its less appealing aspects really quite macho, something I kind of set myself against and found much more in the work of the next generation of Scottish artists who are working maybe in a more sort of neo-conceptual mode than I did within sort of recent painting in Scotland. So I've always had at the heart of my work this real desire to engage with the world, bring that engagement into the studio. I'm lucky to have always had a studio as a kind of critical part of what I do, but then find ways to kind of project those ideas back out into the world, and that can then also take the form of how that work is presented. So it becomes a sort of, if not a replica of that experience, some sort of analogue for it. So it can be, a public fountain in Belgrade, the city of Hamburg, train station in Coventry, soon to be demolished finance ministry building in The Hague, big daft public sculpture at the BBC. All these things kind of come together as a sort of, for want of a better term, an interior landscape that is sort of aggregated over time. So those are the things that I grapple with within my practice. And to conclude, I just wanted to sort of touch on a couple of sort of recent experiences of what I like thinking of as sort of contemporary Scottish painting. The last couple of things, to be honest, that sort of grabbed me outside this exhibition, of course, in terms of kind of what's going on here. And this is a work by Richard Wright that is currently, I think it's still on show at the Modern Institute's Aird's Lane Gallery in Glasgow. Extraordinary wall painting. Richard, though he lives in Norfolk, will forever be a Glasgow artist in my book. And this is a work that, this doesn't exist without painting and without a really serious lifelong engagement with the practice of painting. It steps beyond an op art quality. It has that kind of aesthetic quality I mentioned earlier. It is gouache painted painstakingly directly on the wall of the gallery. And you step into that space and it feels like the space is sort of vibrating. It's incredibly sort of physical. It makes you sort of aware of your body, essentially, and the scale of yourself sort of in this space, as many of his other works have done down the years. And the other thing that's beautiful about it is it disappears at the end of the exhibition. It's fleeting, and is all the better for it. And just to round up, I was lucky to be in America last month with my family, and we'd gone out for bao buns in Chinatown, wandering back along Grant Avenue through Chinatown, looked in a gallery window, thought, that's familiar. Victoria Morton exhibition at Jessica Silverman Gallery. And I managed to make it back to see that show the next morning. A delight. And Vicky is somebody who has a really wonderfully developed, committed, fully fledged painting practice, and it really a testament to the power of painting in Scotland more broadly, visual art in Scotland. I echo Audrey's words earlier on about how challenging the last 10 days have been, given the wider sort of cultural landscape. And I'd like to conclude by saying I'm delighted to see painting in Scotland in such rude health and playing such a kind of vital part in hopefully driving culture forward in this country in a broader sense. So yeah, thank you. That's enough from me.
I'll start with Audrey. Sometimes when you go first, you get forgotten about, so I want to make sure you agree. You actually asked a question in your catalogue entry. You asked, do painting materials such as newsprint, ferric chloride and staples at a purely aesthetic dimension or are they also something which creates meaning and metaphor? You've all talked a little bit about the materials, or a lot about the materials having an impact on that. Have you got an answer for that?
Well, I mean, I think both things are true. So they do create an aesthetic quality. So if you're, that's obvious from I suppose, the act of looking. But equally, I think as you're using these materials, there has to be some sort of intention behind the use of them. So what am I intending by using that? So it has to relate to the kind of layered thinking that I was talking about as well, if that sort of makes sense. Yeah. So the idea of you're dealing with things on various levels, objectively, subjectively, metaphorically, and so thinking as you go that all of those things are at play when you're working with materials as well as metaphor.
So and I'll open this up to all of you. So, I mean, you talked a lot about how important linen is, and clearly different surfaces and metals. And are you using spray paints or?
It's almost all acrylic.
Yeah,
actually, yeah, just acrylic. But I mean, I've always been. There's almost a kind of high and low culture sort of aspect to this. That the reason I showed that Bob Stewart work was because of its sort of objecthood, yeah. I suppose, in this notion of, using highly toxic procyon dyes to paint with. That always appealed to me, sort of jumping the tracks a little bit in terms of whether you should be using a material to paint with or make any kind of art with. And I kind of like that, I guess a sort of metaphorical use of material for me. Sort of I work with aluminium quite a lot, and it feels almost like a stand-in for a material like concrete. It's an industrial material. It's a way of sidestepping being too literal. Yet having a kind of tectonic quality to it that I can't get working on canvas, for example.
It already has that invested in the material. And it's the same for you, Audrey. The stuff that you're using already has some of the things you're playing with in terms of the ideas.
Yeah. And I think, I find that very exciting. So the idea that the materials are substance or matter, and they may also not belong directly to the painting world. They may be unusual to the painting world, like I was talking about ferric chloride, which has been used by artists like Joseph Beuys and Kiefer, and so that's quite interesting to what happens when you do that. So there's a kind of alchemical kind of idea that you're transforming things as you work,
Mm-hmm. Now, Jack, it's great to see your tiny works blown up on the big screen. Wouldn't it be great if you did that, managed to get that? But there's something about that scale for you, obviously, that's really important in terms of the little narratives, but also the physicality of tiny little awkward bits of paint painted with a stick with hair on it, having to kind of try and manipulate it. How important is that process?
Yeah, it's. I feel it is important just in the way that it's sort of directly. After working with the process of the materials in this sort of more, a freeing way, I then sort of berate myself into this process of working on this tiny little piece with this focus. So it goes from large gestural movements, working on multiple pieces at once, to this really sort of concentrated effort. And I don't know if it's going to continue to be the most important thing for me. It's just sort of one of the ways I work at the moment, but I'm planning to work slightly larger, maybe that size. Watch this space.
Certainly means you can get a lot of stuff up in your studio wall and look at them at the same time. So I'll open this up to the floor. Has there anybody got a particular question they would like to ask any of our panel, or just a commentary of what someone said? Is anyone going to start the ball rolling? We've got somebody over here. Amy.
Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted Amy. Looking at your catalogue, I thought the exhibition is great. It has just so many words. I feel very often these kind of various and abstract works become the whole explanation has become very verbose and into itself and difficult words. Is that necessary?
Who'd like to answer that?
Well, it took me 3 months to write my statement because obviously I'm no writer and I failed everything academically, miserable and deeply dyslexic. So it's quite a trigger point for me. But and my artist statement before I wrote that was 2 lines and said very little. I struggle to write mine, and I prefer not to write or explain my work. But having said that, and the statement that I wrote is still quite short, but I think it was important to do it for me, actually, and I feel like it was good to be forced into a situation where I was made to write something and actually think about it. And for the purposes of this show, I think it was an interesting task to be set, actually. And it did make me think a huge amount. So I don't know about anyone else.
Yeah, I think it's helpful in that it helps you reflect on what you've been doing. I agree. It's not my favourite thing to do. I'd prefer somebody wrote it for me. But there is a requirement now, that, in terms of work in the public realm, that there has to be something said about it. It has to be contextualised, and I think that can help people find a way into the work when it's,
We were hoping by the question that we asked all the artists this time, that rather than it being them telling us what the work was about, it was for the artists to then reflect what is it about paint that makes it a compelling medium. And I think to some degree it's slightly less pretentious or verbose than you might get in other exhibitions.
It's an interesting sort of question to ask, because a little bit like being asked to talk about Scottish painting, like, I've not really thought about sort of quote unquote Scottish painting for decades. And yeah, I mean, I think the functional language in relation to sort of talking about painting in particular is a funny one. And I did an interview with somebody talking about the work of the amazing constructionist artist Mary Martin last week, and it made me dig out a load of books in the studio. And I actually thought tonight, as I had a couple of quotes I thought I'll kick my waffle off with before I binned my script, and just thought I'll just freestyle it. Too many words. But there was a fantastic Mary Martin quote, which I now wish I'd brought with me because it's incredibly apposite in relation to your question, but it ended up being, you have to start with the painting. You can talk around it, but look at the work. And I think it's often a rule I have to impose on myself, looking at work, where you kind of almost sort of absentmindedly wander over and read the panel before you look at the work. Like, don't do that. Look at the work, and you don't have to read the words.
Well, looking here at Kevin Hogman's little aisle, it was written by ChatGPT, so they're all around it.
Yeah. And I mean, if there's that old sort of Cindy Sherman quote, I think it was around, her being sort of asked to kind of explain her work or kind of use language to kind of express what she was doing, and her response was, that's somebody else's job, which is nice if you've got budgets like I imagine Cindy Sherman has, not so much for the likes of us who have to either, slave over the laptop or engage ChatGPT.
If I can just add, Flora, by the way, who's just sitting here, if I introduce Flora Lefang, who's my co-curator, it was her job to rattle everyone to get to write the stuff, and one of our artists didn't play ball at all. And those of you that have seen the exhibition, how many people have actually seen the exhibition here? Pretty much all of you, fantastic. You might remember there's a series of paintings that are speech bubbles, shaped by Joe Fan, and he just wouldn't write a piece. He got somebody else to write something, but it wasn't in his words, so instead he just put another speech bubble in, and that was of one of his paintings. So that was his statement. So and some of them are very long, some of them are, as you say, Kevin's got AI to answer his questions, very clever, amusing, and some of them are quite poetic. I actually find that part of it quite difficult, answering that. Can I just, before I open up further to the floor, because just touch on something, Rowan and Toby, you talked about the legacy of the paintings that you grew up with and in your family and around, for both of you in your family and around you. But you say, Toby, that you haven't considered painting a Scottish activity. Is that what you mean by that? Or it's an international activity? Or
yeah, I mean, I guess I think it's probably maybe a little bit of a legacy of sort of, you know, what I sort of touched on earlier on, the sort of position of painting when I was studying in the Department of Drawing and Painting at Glasgow School of Art in the sort of early 90s, because they'd obviously, under Sandy Moffat, esteemed academician, you know, that era of Scottish painting in the second half of the 80s was an absolute triumph for that school, and that cast a really long shadow. And I think there was a sort of, on one hand, a desire to kind of get out from underneath that, but also a sort of newfound internationalism, I suppose, which, you know, of kind of revisiting some sort of Enlightenment ideas about, can we stay in Scotland and work as artists rather than, you know, sort of moving to London and doing it that way, and make connections to Europe and North America.
And during the late 90s,
always thinking internationally.
Yeah, and during the late 90s and early 2000s, it was the place to be a contemporary artist. There were all the Turner Prize winners were coming from graduates from Glasgow School of Art.
And it's sad to kind of feel in some ways that, you know, post-crash, post-Brexit, post-pandemic, like, you know, a lot of that has retreated, but it's also the fact that the circus moves on in international terms, and that's why it's been so nice to be involved in Frontiers and in this project, because there's kind of real energy here, and it's energy that's located in Scotland, and there's a dialogue going.
And Rowan, you went off to the States to see how partly to test your painting in a different place and learn new things. Did you find there was just a parallel world, or was that a very different world, and there was something particular about Scotland that was no longer there or present as a painter?
Yeah, it was a bit of a culture shock actually for me, because the dialogue around fashion and trend in Chelsea in New York was so huge and intimidating that I sort of, by the end of it, craved coming home. The art stars were in the making, and most of the people that I studied with are now huge. So it was quite, but I also felt sort of quite odd about that. It didn't sit sort of well with me, and it didn't feel as perhaps honest as what the place where Scottish painting had been before. But having said that, there was a guy that came while I was over there, a German curator called Klaus Biesenbach. He came in to give a lecture on painting, and I don't know, somebody told him that there was a Scot in the programme. And the first thing he said was, the first thing he did was talk about Glasgow and the painting there and the history of painting there. And I was like, yeah, that's right. So that was exciting, and it felt like, yeah, there had been what Toby had referenced, the heroism, and also the machismo, but the heroism of painting in Scotland
at that time.
Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, do we have somebody from the audience here, down here? Mary, we'll do you next.
Could I just ask you, is it important to you that your works are bought by members of the public? Does that matter to you at all?
Now there's no public funding anymore. It's incredibly important.
Yeah.
I think it depends. Well, I'll speak as a panel member. I think it depends on what other income you have. If you have no other income, and it's your means, whether it's through applications for funding of projects, or whether it's through direct sales or commissions, that is an important part of being an artist, and it's finding a way for that have a mixed economy for you to survive. Absolutely.
The reason I ask, I mean, you might think it was a rather odd question for me to ask, but it chimes a bit with the lady behind me. And it is that when one goes as a member of the public to a show such as this and whatever, one goes often, very much committed to the arts, very much committed to there being artists and painters and such like. And sometimes you go in and the opacity of the work of art to the member of the public is very striking. And if an artist doesn't want to give any clues to somebody like me, then why would I get out my debit card? Because, for example, the references to Rilke tonight, I wouldn't begin to know those or know that was in those lovely works that were on the wall and such like. And therefore, I wouldn't be getting the clues or the depths, because sometimes I feel artists, all of it, you spend so many hours thinking about things, exploring, experimenting, often over years. We've heard how coming backwards and forwards and everything to create what you've created. And I come in and look, and I'm expected, and I do go and look first, and I'm expected to get it or to get the debt or whatever, but I do need some clues, I sometimes feel. And I sometimes feel the artists are a bit unkind to me, the viewer, because you have immersed yourselves and you've had the indulgence, the time to look at and study Rilke or study whoever. I'm just by chance I'm using those ones. Don't.
Well, I'm glad you're getting a good name.
But such, and I do sometimes feel that you don't help those of us who want to be more engaged. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting, but I do think, I suppose I've always thought, and I grew up in an area without any art. I grew up in Grangemouth. When I was a child, it felt like a cultural desert. But the thing is about art is it's there to make you think. So I do believe that the viewer has to do a bit of work too. Of course, the artist tries their best to express the work they're doing in the best possible way, but there has to be it's there to make you think. So there is work to be done, I think, on both sides, perhaps.
Toby?
Yeah, my sort of thought on that front is, everything. The reason that I am an artist is because in my life I've encountered things that have baffled me or seemed obdurate, or in some cases, particularly when I was a kid, and my sort of interest in modern architecture really stems from being scared of it as a kid. And I think there's a sort of durational aspect to this, where if you're bothered enough by something, and even if you don't like it, it gets in there and you keep coming back to it. And it's a big ask for viewers or for an audience, but I would posit that if there is a work in this exhibition that you wake up in the middle of the night and you're like, oh God, that thing's in there, and I really don't like it, or what the hell was that about? It is a process of sort of engaging and asking questions, and it goes right to what the previous questioner said about, on one hand, exclamation can kill a thing stone dead. On the other hand, obduracy within any given work can repel an audience. That's a very difficult balance to strike, and in some degrees I do feel tempted to refer you back to Cindy Sherman and that's not our job. But it's a serious business, and I think that notion of like an earworm, when a single work here and there, and you don't need to like everything, it's an open field.
There's a man here, actually. I think he's had his hand up a few times.
Oh. Go to this chap first, yeah.
Hello. I'm not an artist. I'm coming out of philosophy, and I feel that something's missing from the way you're handling Walter Benjamin. I think if you don't have a sense that history might end very badly, you're not reading Walter Benjamin. And also that he's keen on images. Why? Because he believes images move people to action. So there has to be a sense of action. Something's going to happen, he hopes. But particularly what's going to happen is an odd kind of thing happening, which is that history is brought to a shuddering stop. And I think his dialectical image would be, certainly I felt your house that you had, that was a kind of Benjamin image, because for those people, they'd been kicked out of that house. Whereas
it burned down.
Yeah, they'd been burned out.
Yeah.
Exactly. So whereas the pile of rubble didn't quite make it on that register, just another pile of rubble to me. And I do think that's why you do have to have often quite a lot of words sometimes with some things, so that you can get that fight between the obduracy of the material, which keeps returning you to this actually happened, this existed, or I made this exist. But the key point, I think, is that Walter Benjamin didn't view art as a creative activity. He viewed it as a destructive activity, and properly so. Walter Benjamin's image, whether it's of a vast, seagull-infested rubbish heap or something, it brings things to a stop. Things cannot go on. And I think if you're going to use Walter Benjamin, I think he's a great person to use, it has to have that sense. So I also say that my instructor at the University of Toronto always used to use which tear. I couldn't understand anything.
Some great points. Does anyone want to respond to any of that? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Marion, then yourself down there.
Hi, I'm interested in how the changing organisational structures at art schools will influence painting in the future, because most departments are fine art, where the students have a massive range of things that they can go into. So it's extensive. But what I am super impressed with everyone is that you all have fantastic skills with paint. But nowadays in art schools there are not very many painters teaching in fine art, painters that have an understanding of painting. So I wonder if the members of the panel could talk about one of their tutors' influences on them, or how important that was to them, that they were taught tacit skills.
I'm going to ask Jack to answer that, actually, because you went to Gray's School of Art in Aberdeen, didn't you?
Yeah.
And I was a lecturer there for many years as well. And there's a particularity, because that still has, up until this year, a dedicated painting department.
So it's changed.
Yeah, it's now becoming part of contemporary art practice.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fantastic is what I was going to say. Yeah, well, at my time, the whole sort of art school structure and the way it went and the way it was sort of involved within the university and the certain hoops that you have to jump through, which you would think that you wouldn't have to jump through in an art school. There's a certain level now of bureaucracy attached and unartistic endeavours which just sort of delay your process. But in the times you spend in the studio, it was all the tutors for me. It was just, if I'd gone to a different art school, I wouldn't have still been an artist. If Andrew Cranston, who's exhibiting in the show, he was my tutor for 3 of the 4 years there, and just basically just in the tutorials, actually sitting down with someone and actually not talking about painting was mostly what was fun about it. Sort of talking about the influences around it, or just talking about other things that you happen to be interested in, and then you'd go back to the canvas or whatever you were doing and it would somehow feed in. I don't really know how that would happen, and that's why I've never really thought about becoming a tutor myself. I mean, I see that it's such an important thing to do, and you need to have working artists as tutors, but it seems like a very difficult job to do, so I wouldn't wish it on people. But.
What's the problem? I mean, I'm kind of quite qualified to answer this, having taught in a number of different art schools, both in Scotland and down south. And one of the reasons I came back to Scotland was because I was trying to teach painting to departments that had long since disintegrated into departments of fine art, and at a time when if you weren't making video projections and dance performance, I worked at a place called University College Chichester, which had woods all around it. There's sort of candles out in the lawn and all the rest of it at night, and all sorts of. There was a dance department as well, so it kind of intermingled. But I got said, well, why are you teaching your students to paint? Why are you teaching them to paint? Well, that's what I do, and they want to learn. Yeah, well, where are they going to go with their painting? There's no career for them in that. So I came back to Scotland, and in the late 2000s, but 2007, 2008, and it was still evident that despite all the economical changes, the pressures to have a research, when I say a research culture, is research becomes the starting point for making art rather than the making art. There's a kind of difference there, and I think that has impacted on painting. Edinburgh College of Art have a painting pathway now rather than a department, and there's still dedicated teachers of painting there, but will they keep employing them? Who knows? It's somebody that's got a PhD will probably get a job over a painter. I can say that because I don't work in that department, so I can say that quite clearly. So I think there are really serious challenges ahead. But what I've said in my essay in the catalogue is that painting seems to, I think you've all said it, painting seems to wriggle out of the box, no matter what restrictions you put on it. Students and graduates and artists will find a way. Tracy Emin's practice is 100% painting now, whether you like it or not. That's what she does. She's found her way. I mean, you talked about Damien Hirst and his I'll come in at the last minute and splatter some paint on somebody else's work, painting. But that's what he does. We all return there in the end.
Yes, the iconoclasts return there. No, I think it's interesting about that, and this in a way goes back to that kind of question of materiality. I liked your notion of sort of painting squirming out from sort of a position of suppression or whatever, and I think it goes back to the physicality of it. I mean, it makes me think of sort of the work of Richard Wright's that I showed, that is sort of incredibly refined in a material way, but its physical impact on the viewer is a result of the application of material in a really specific way, and that sort of physicality of materials used in making art of all sorts of different kinds. It will be interesting to see the extent to which that is entirely transplanted by digital media, because I don't think that's going to happen. I think equally about ceramics. I mean, there is this exhibition is brilliant evidence of a vibrant sort of painting culture in this country. I think about ceramics. There's an absolute upswell of sort of interest in using that medium in sort of new and innovative ways. However many decades after Glasgow School of Art shut their ceramics department, now half their students are like, we want to work in ceramics. Like, oh, there's no facilities. So there is something there in the kind of material quality of this stuff that will abide, I think.
I think we had a question down here.
The four different views of painting made me think about painting overall, and the different images and shapes and sizes and ways that you did things really hit me directly on. And it made me think of other art forms that I'm interested in as well: opera, theatre, singing. And it seems to me these other art forms are really getting into giving me a message right now, a very repetitive message, and you're speaking directly through your art form. So I just want to be so thankful that I appreciate an art form that's not giving me a very repetitive political message all the time, speaking directly to me. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right up in the middle there, Michelle's up there with her hand up. Samuel's on to you. Last one.
I just wanted to say it's great to be in a room with all these people talking about painting. It's absolutely fantastic. Something that Jack said, which really resonated with me, was about the unease of being a painter, or just the unease, perhaps, of being an artist. And I was wondering if it's a particular thing with painters, that sense of unease, and how it's actually, I think you said it's also valuable, like you didn't want to get rid of it too soon. And is that because of the open-ended nature of painting, or the precarity of it, or what do you think? That idea really, I thought, yes, you're right.
Yeah, I think it's probably, it could be applied to artists sort of all over, not specifically painters, but I can only speak for myself, as everything I said was, because I don't really know, but that feeling of sort of imposter syndrome or something, or just stepping out with yourself and looking at the absurdity of what you do.
I think also being open, having to remain open for really long periods, where you don't really know where it's going, and you have to kind of retain your position regardless. It is this sense of
suspend that
disbelief.
disbelief.
And self-belief that doesn't exist but has to sort of somehow.
Yeah.
But that sort of unease.
I feel like if you don't have that, though, you have to sort of make a decision. You have to decide that something is the most important thing. It's like creating a sort of religion for yourself, and it's quite dogmatic in a sense.
Yeah, you have to make a decision.
Exactly. You have to believe in everything that you say about painting, and that's not... The minute I say something, I think that the exact opposite, and then argue with myself about it. So that's just going to keep going, I think, for me.
Just when the conversation's getting really interesting, we have come to the end of our time. I just want to finish off by saying, and I think it relates to what the lady in the red there was saying, that I think all of us none of us have talked about our audience. Or, are we painting for an audience? Because actually, I think one of the things that doesn't matter whether you're a painter or any kind of artist. I think one of the things that we do first is, what are we able to do, and will there be an audience for it? Becomes not secondary, but it becomes the next thing we ask, rather than it being, so there's that I think is a part of the answer to your question. Anyway, thank you very much all for coming along. I'm glad most of you, if not all of you, have been to see the exhibition. Go and see it again. It's only on for another 2 weeks. Is it less than 2 weeks now?
Yeah.
In fact, less than 2 weeks. And tell everyone else about it. And challenge yourself to see, if I had the money to buy one, which one would it be? And why?
I would reiterate that. Thank you, Robbie. And thank you so much to all our speakers this evening. I'm sure you'll agree it's been a fascinating conversation. This obviously represents a small number of the artists showing in the exhibition. So thank you to all the exhibitors. We've been so pleased to work on it. It's been fantastic. There's about 10 days left to see the show. Please do also support the Academy by purchasing the catalogue. There's some really interesting bits of writing in it, some wonderful imagery as well, and it's a lovely object to have to remind you of the show. So thank you very much again. Good evening.